Okay, so let's continue our discussion with the incoherence of the philosophers. So, in our last video, we talked about how the philosophers argued against the temporality or the beginningness of the universe, and Al-Ghazali refuted them. We looked at what the philosopher argued and what arguments they presented, and we talked about how Al-Ghazali was refuting it. We began with it. So we stopped basically at Al-Ghazali starting to argue against the philosophers. And one of the arguments that the philosophers gave is that the temporality of the universe cannot occur with an eternal being. If you want to know what we are discussing here, please go watch the previous video. I would highly recommend you do watch the previous video, which was part 4. So this is what Al-Ghazali is now going to do. Al-Ghazali is going to show that the logical necessity that they are talking about and the principles that they are using, it can be used against them and ought to be used against them, and they can be shown to counter them rather than counter us or counter Al-Ghazali, meaning to show that the universe is temporal, we can use the same logical principles. So basically, the philosophers were using the logical principles that we know by logical necessity. In a sense, if you were to put it in a proper sense, that the logical necessity is that there cannot be any contradiction, contradictions cannot exist. We know this by logical necessity, absurdities cannot exist. And a temporal thing coming about from an eternal being is a kind of contradiction, a kind of absurdity. Right? This is the way that the philosophers are trying to argue. So Al-Ghazali says, first of all, that he argues that these things are not known by logical necessity. If you're saying that these principles are logically necessary, then we would know them by themselves, or either you gave a syllogistic argument, which they didn't. We covered this in the previous video. Now Al-Ghazali is going to argue how the position that the universe is eternal leads to a contradiction from these logical principles. I'm using these terminologies not exactly as Al-Ghazali in the book does, but to explain it better. So what is the argument that Al-Ghazali uses? So Al-Ghazali uses a beautiful argument, one that even contemporary Christian philosopher like William Lane Craig has used in one of his videos, which is present online, a philosophical argument why an infinite universe cannot exist. I'm going to take a few sips of chai right now. Bismillah. Alhamdulillah. Okay, perfect. So yeah, this is what Al-Ghazali is going to do now. So Al-Ghazali now has laid this foundation. Now he's going to argue. He says that the logical necessary principles that you're applying on us can be applied on you. How so? He says, let's say the universe is eternal. Okay, let's say the universe is eternal. Now this is what Al-Ghazali is arguing. Let's say the universe is eternal. It leads to a kind of impossibility. What is that impossibility? Al-Ghazali says that if the philosophers say the universe is eternal, the world's past eternity is impossible because it leads to affirming circular movements of the heavenly spheres whose number is infinite and whose individual units are innumerable, right? Even though they divide into a sixth, a fourth, a half. For the sphere of the sun rotates in 1 year, and so on and so forth. So what is Al-Ghazali arguing here? He's saying that if you say that the universe is eternal and it always existed, then the rotation of the heavenly spheres, right? The movement of the heavenly spheres, basically the orbits in a sense, right? The heavenly spheres, they move, they rotate, they have a circular movement. We call them orbits. So these orbits that they have, if the universe always existed, so basically you need to understand, the Aristotelian philosophers did not believe in a Big Bang. They didn't say that the universe began to exist and it formed. They believed that the universe was eternal, always existed, and these orbits, they also always existed, right? So Al-Ghazali is using their own principles against them. Bismillah. So he's saying that if you say that the universe is eternal, always existed, then what happens? The thing that happens is that, yes, the universe will be eternal. The eternality of the universe leads to the necessity that there is an innumerable amounts of rotations of the orbits. If the universe always existed and let's say the sun was rotating since eternality, then how many rotations of the sun have occurred? We'll say infinite, right? And infinite is innumerable. So this is basically what Al-Ghazali is saying. He's saying that this would be the case, right? But the issue that arises with this is that even though this is the case, they still can be divided. If they're innumerable, how are they divisible? Meaning that if they're eternal, then how is it that one is a sixth, a fourth, and so on and so forth? So I'll explain this a bit more. Let's read it. For the sphere of the sun rotates in 1 year, whereas Saturn rotates in 30, so that the rotation of Saturn are a third, a tenth of those of sun. Now, what does Al-Ghazali say? Al-Ghazali is saying that the sun rotates in 1 year, right? The sun rotates in 1 year. Okay, so yeah, for the Aristotelian philosophers, they believed in a kind of geocentrism rather than heliocentrism, right? I believe I'm using the words correctly. So basically, they believe that the Earth was the center of the orbits, right? So Al-Ghazali is saying that the sun rotates in a year. This is what we call a year, right? But Saturn rotates how many times? In 30 years. So the orbit of the sun is 1. The orbit of Saturn is 30. So it is a 30th, right? So Al-Ghazali says a third of a tenth, which is correct. A third of a tenth, meaning tenth and a third. So 1 over 30 in a sense, right? So you're saying that they both are infinite, innumerable, but 1 over 30 as well. So let me break this argument down. Let's not make it too complicated. Let's take the sun and Saturn, right? So the sun has an orbit that takes, or the orbit of the sun is 1 year, right? And the orbit of the Saturn is 30 years. Now the universe is eternal. How many times has the sun rotated, or how many orbits of the sun have been completed according to Aristotelians, which would be Ibn Sīnā and so on and so forth? And how many orbits have Saturn taken, which would also be infinite? How can it be the case that one happens once a year and the other happens once every 30 years, but they both have the same orbit, or the same number of orbits, which is infinite or innumerable? So Al-Ghazali is saying this is absurd, when basically saying that this is illogical, right? And basically we can divide this argument in two ways that we can say this is illogical. One would be that if they're innumerable, then it should be that they both are identical in their numbers of orbits. If they're identical in their numbers of orbits, then how can it be the case that one happens once a year and the other happens 30 years, but they have the same number of orbits? That's absurd. The other way Al-Ghazali here argues is that basically think of this like this, right? Is the number of rotations even or odd? Either it is even or odd, meaning let's say the sun rotated an infinite numbers of times, right? Is the rotation of the sun even or odd, right? Or is it both even and odd, or neither even nor odd? Al-Ghazali is basically saying that it cannot be neither nor can it be both, because if a thing is numerable, we can count it, then it will either be even or odd. It cannot be both. The fact is that if it is infinite, then it cannot be one of the other. It has to be either even or odd, or it is both, which is absurd. It cannot be both, neither can it be neither. So it has to be even or odd, but it cannot be even or odd because it is infinite. So he's saying this is the absurdity, that even though it should be even or odd, it is not. Right? So this is the absurdity that Al-Ghazali is trying to show. That basically, I'm going to break this down again. that if the universe is eternal, then infinite numbers of orbits have taken place. There are two different kinds of absurdities that arise. That if the sun orbits faster than Jupiter or Saturn, then the rotations of sun should be more than of Jupiter. But the thing is that if it is eternal, then they both are equal. This is absurd. They should be equal, but one is more. There should be one more than the other, but they both are equal. Absurd. The other problem arises that if they're countable, meaning we can count it like 1 rotation, 2 rotation, 3 rotation, then the numbers of rotation, the rotation that occurred right now, for example, should either be even or odd. But the thing is that it is neither or both. And it cannot be neither or both because it is countable. Anything that is countable is either even or odd. Al-Ghazali says that the philosophers can object to it like this. That it is only the finite that is described as either even or odd, but the infinite is not described as such. So Al-Ghazali basically what they're saying, and this is a lot of times people mention this, when we say that an infinite regress is impossible because of such and such reason, a lot of the time people say that no, an infinite regress is not impossible, and this issue does not occur with the infinite because an infinite is not described as the finite. So basically Al-Ghazali is also answering this. He says that an aggregate composed of units having, as has been mentioned, a sixth, a tenth, which is yet not described as either even or odd, is something whose falsity is known by necessity without theoretical reflection. With what argument can you disentangle yourself from this? If it is then said, right? Okay, now the second point, I'll get to it later. So Al-Ghazali is saying that the thing is that these things are aggregated, meaning that you can add to it. If I can the numbers of orbits are being added to. Every time the sun orbits more, the number of orbit is added on. Correct? Perfect. Perfectamundo. Bismillah. Right? It's being added on. So it is aggregated. And if anything is aggregated, then it has to be described by either even or odd, which is basically the argument that I said. He's saying that the fact that it is not is known by necessity of reason. Then the philosophers may say, the place of error in this argument lies in the fact that you are basically treating this passing of the time or the orbiting of the orbits of the heavenly spheres is a theoretical but not actual. What are the philosophers saying? They're saying that, see, when the next orbit occurs, the previous orbit does not exist. And when the next orbit after that will occur, this orbit that is occurring will not exist. Because as time passes, the past ceases to exist. So there is no aggregation, there is no adding on. Only one thing exists, which is the now. This is what the philosophers are saying. So Al-Ghazali responds to this as well. Right? So the numbers divides into the even and the odd, and it is impossible for it to lie outside this division, regardless of whether or not, if it is enumerated, exists and endures or ceases to exist. Right? See, he says that it does not matter if it exists or ceases to exist. Meaning he's saying that it does not matter that if the enumerated exists or doesn't exist. If it is innumerable in the mind or in actuality, as long as it is innumerable, then it is either even or odd. For example, he gives this example. Suppose a number of horses. A necessary consequence of the number of horses would be that it is either even or odd, regardless of whether or not we reckon them existing or not existing. Should they cease to exist after existing, the proposition does not change. Meaning that if we imagine an infinite number of horses, if we imagine horses, right? Or I imagine a number of horses. If I do imagine it, then I can say it is either even or odd. If there are a number of horses, then it has to be even or odd. It is irrespective if the horse exists or they don't exist. Right? And then Al-Ghazali now he's pointing the gun now at the philosophers. He's saying that forget about these. things that I'm saying. The kind of argument that you're trying to use against us can be used against literally your own philosophical positions. For example, Al-Ghazali talks about the Aristotelian position of the philosophers, which is that the souls, right? He talks about the soul, that it is impossible for it to lie outside this division, regardless of whether or not what is in. According to your own principles, Al-Ghazali says, it is not impossible that there should be existence present here and now, which are individual entities, varying in descriptions and which are infinite. These are the souls of the humans that are separated from the bodies after death. These then are existence that are not characterized as even or odd because they're infinite. They're numerable. They're individual souls which are numerable, right? But at the same time, they exist but are neither even or odd. He says this is absurd. The falsity of this, would you deny of someone who says the falsity of this is known through the necessity of reason? And he says that the argument that you are trying to use against the theologians or Muslims or the Sunni Muslim theologians, that the universe is finite but the creator is infinite or eternal, and the creator is eternal and he causes the finite universe or temporal. He says there is a connectedness. And the argument that you're trying to use against this connectedness, you're arguing that you have not yet presented, this connectedness is known by logical necessity to be false. This same kind of argument I'm showing you can be used against you. Basically this is what Al-Ghazali is saying. As for what the Aristotelians or Aristotle himself believed, I'm not exactly sure if Aristotle actually believed in this as such. Okay, it could be the case that the Muslim Aristotelian did hold this position. I'll need to read more on this for Aristotle's own position. So with that being said, let's move on. Then the philosopher may argue, because obviously there are mainly two groups of philosophers, the Aristotelian and the Platonic, right? So the followers of Plato, or let's be very frank, Neoplatonic. But let's say they're the people who believe in the position of Plato on the soul, and there is another group who believes in the position of Aristotle on soul. So Aristotle argued that the universe is, the souls are individual souls that actually exist and they're infinite, right? And the actual existence of the soul are here, right? While Plato, he said that there is a pre-eternal soul, and there are individuations of the soul, right? So there's actual one pre-eternal soul, or the perfect soul, right? So Al-Ghazali is saying this is even worse. He's saying this is even worse. Why is this even worse? So let's break this down here. So Al-Ghazali is saying this is worse, more repulsion, and more worthy to uphold as contrary to rational necessity. For example, we say, is the soul of Zaid, let's say there's a guy named Zaid, okay, or John, is it identical to that of Sīnā? John, Sīnā, right? Is the soul of John identical to that of Sīnā? No, it's not. They are distinct, right? We will say that obviously they are not identical, because if they were identical, then they would share, the same memories and so on and so forth. They're not identical. They have to be distinct to be different individuals. But if they are distinct, Zaid and Amar, or John and Sīnā, if they are distinct, then how is it that there is one soul? If identical, then both would be equal cognition, which are essential attributes of the soul, and which include with the soul in every relation. Meaning that if they are distinct individuals, but there is one soul or one eternal soul that it individualizes. Basically saying that Al-Ghazali is basically arguing that if there is John and there is Sīnā, and there's only one soul which individualizes in these two individuals, right, or particularizes in these two individuals, right, the universe becomes a particular, then the essential attribute of the soul, which is the cognition and so on and so forth, would be identical as well. But it is not. Al-Ghazali is saying that soul has cognition. Basically, the essential attribute of the soul is, you can say, what we can conceive and the consciousness, you can say. He's saying that if the soul was identical, then their consciousness would be identical as well. But if the consciousness is distinct, then the soul is also necessarily distinct. The individuation of the one through attachment to the bodies, we say, the individuation of the one that has no magnitude in terms of size and quantitative measures is known by necessity of reason to be impossible. How then will the one become two, nay, 1,000, then revert to becoming one? This is only intelligible things that have magnitude and quantity. Meaning, if there is something that is divisible, right? For Aristotle, the soul, the perfect form, is not divisible or actually divisible. It only individualizes. So if it is not divisible, then how does it become 1, 2, 3, or even 1,000? Right? This is impossible, known by reason. How then will the one become? Okay, so this is only intelligible in things that have magnitude and quantity, like water of the sea that divides through streams and rivers and then turns back to the sea. So Al-Ghazali closes this kind of argument by saying that the whole thing that I've presented is basically to show that that the philosophers have not rendered our position, or the opponent's position, what Al-Ghazali's position is, to be impossible by rational necessity. And what is that position? It is that there is an eternal will with a temporal act. Right? So let's pause it here. It has been 20 minutes. I would say this is a good amount of discussion. So yeah. So Al-Ghazali basically broke the entire discussion down. Now we have seen a lot of things. Now in our next session or next video, inshallah it will be sooner than later, we will be talking about what another objection the philosophers might raise, which is that the philosophers could say that with what would you deny one who relinquishes the appeal to necessity of reason and proves that there is an eternal will connected to a temporal act is impossible. Okay. In other way, mainly that time are equal with respect to the possibility of will's attachment to any of them. This is another discussion. We will get to them when we get to it. Right? So if you like the video, please do leave a like, subscribe, and if you want to support my channel, there's going to be a Patreon link in the description. With that, let's end today's discussion. I'm very happy to, it was very difficult for me to break down this argument by Al-Ghazali. It's very complex. Even though this argument just lasts for 2 or 3 pages, it took me 20 minutes just to cover the basis of this argument. So with that, let's end this discussion. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.